with that, today we are going to be going over, we're going to be finishing up talking about the heart, and then we're going to take a look at the blood vessels. And so I'm going to take over your screen now. So you should be able to see this YouTube video, hopefully. Yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to be taking a look at how the heart is able to contract today. So on Monday, we looked at the anatomy of the heart and all the different chambers and how the heart is kind of structured. Today, we're going to be looking at how it actually operates. So one of the things that's really cool about the heart is we're going to see that it's going to be able to contract, and look at the way it's going to be able to contract as well. Okay. So go ahead and take a look at this video here. Okay. So we see a heart that's been removed from the body. So this is a transplant. And so, hold on. Okay, let me kind of pull this back real quick. Oh no, what happened? Okay, hold on, sorry, technical difficulties. This wasn't supposed to happen. Oh, error. Okay, hold on. Okay, let's try this one more time. And I'll just kind of leave it at its regular screen. Okay, hold on. All right, any second now. Okay, well, while this is loading, when we take a look at the heart and we look at the way it contracts, does the heart contract all at once, or does it contract kind of in segments in a coordinated manner?
Segments.
In segments, right. So it's not going to be all contracting at the same time, because if it were to do so, it would create a ton of pressure inside the heart, and it would basically cause the heart to, end up popping itself, which we don't want to have happen. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking a look at the heart and how it's able to contract. So here we're looking at a heart transplant. Okay. And so we're going to be taking a look at something pretty cool that happens. So it's not going to be contracting a whole lot right now, but even outside of the body, we are going to end up seeing that the heart is able to contract. Okay. And so even outside the body, it doesn't necessarily need the nervous system or need anything other than its own self in order to contract, in order to beat blood or beat and push blood throughout the heart and throughout the system. So, which is pretty incredible. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a look at how the heart is able to do that. Okay. And so hopefully you guys can see the PowerPoint now. Is everyone able to see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So as we can see, the heart doesn't need anything other than its own self in order to contract. Okay, it doesn't need the nervous system, it doesn't need anything else in the body. All it needs is itself. So the reason the heart is able to contract on its own is because it has specific cells in it called autorhythmic cells, and these are able to generate their own action potentials. Okay? So if you remember from chapter 10 when we were looking at skeletal muscle in order to contract needs to have a muscle action potential. Okay, in order to create that muscle action potential, you need a nerve action potential that stimulates the muscle to have a muscle action potential. Okay, in the case of a heart, that's not necessary. Okay, it has specific cells in the heart that are able to generate their own action potentials, even when they're disconnected from any nerves or anything like that. Okay, so they're able to generate their own contractions as a result of that. Which is pretty cool. And so the nerves are able to connect it to the heart. However, those nerves are not going to be necessary. Okay? So the nerves that are connected to the heart can help to regulate the heart rate, but they're not going to be determining every single beat that the heart is able to manufacture and to make. Okay? Every beat is going to be generated by its own autorhythmic cells. Okay? And so for that reason, we call those autorhythmic cells the pacemakers of the heart, because they're going to be regulating how quickly the heart is going to be beating. Okay, does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at today is the cardiac conduction system. And so that's going to be the route that those action potentials are going to be taking throughout the heart. And that route is going to determine which segments of the heart are going to be able to contract at any given point in time. Okay. And so that's going to allow a coordinated muscle contraction throughout the muscle. Okay. So this is what the cardiac conduction system looks like here. Okay. So there's one specific area. So there's a total of 5 areas that are going to be important. Okay. The first area is called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, and that's going to be found here inside the right atrial wall. Okay. Inside those right atrial wall, that inside the SA node, there's going to be specific autorhythmic cells that are able to generate those action potentials. Okay. And then those action potentials are going to move through the heart, through those gap junctions inside the intercalated discs of the cardiac muscle fibers. Okay. So because this is the first guy to start producing action potentials, the SA node itself is usually regarded as the pacemaker of the heart. Okay. This is the specific autorhythmic cells that are going to act as the pacemakers. Okay. And so these will be setting the rhythm for every muscle contraction within the heart. Okay. Now, again, the nervous system and various hormones are going to be able to regulate and alter the pace of those contractions, but they are not going to actually trigger each individual beat. Okay. Those beats are going to be generated by the action potentials made by the SA node. Okay. So the thing about the SA node is that it will typically generate about 100 action potentials a minute. Okay. And every action potential leads to a contraction. Okay. Now, as we know, we're not going to be having about 100 heartbeats every single minute. Okay. Our heartbeats are typically about 55 to 65 beats per minute. Okay. So there's something there that's preventing our heart from contracting that much. Okay. What happens here is we have this hormone, or this neurotransmitter, which we saw previously, which is acetylcholine, and it's going to actually have an inhibitory effect on the muscle contraction. Okay. So if we remember looking at skeletal muscle, acetylcholine helps to actually stimulate muscle contractions, kind of in an excitatory way, kind of exciting the skeletal muscle to contract. In cardiac muscle, acetylcholine actually has the opposite effect. And so instead of creating action potentials, acetylcholine causes the action potentials to slow down. Okay? So instead of having about 100 action potentials a minute, you're having about 75 action potentials a minute, which would eventually lead to about 75 heartbeats per minute. Even that is still a little bit high. And so we have to have a way of kind of slowing that down even further to about 55 to 65 beats per minute. So here's the way this happens. Okay, so we have the SA node generating that action potential, and it's going to spread throughout the right atrium and throughout the left atrium. From there, the action potential then reaches the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. Okay? And in the AV node, which sits inside the interatrial septum, the action potential slow down even further. Okay? And so then it slows it down to about 55-ish beats per minute. Okay, so that's where we get our actual normal heart rate from. Okay. So it slows down significantly at that point, and by slowing down the action potentials, that allows the atria to have enough time to fully eject blood into the right ventricle over here. Okay. So by slowing down these action potentials, it slows down the contraction and allows more time to eject that blood into the ventricles. Everyone followed me so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Any questions here before we go forward?
No.
1 second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So these are the 2 most important pacemakers within the heart. Okay. So then from there, that's going to be the second place we see a muscle contraction occurring. Okay. Then from there, that action potential is going to move into this region over here, which is called the bundle of His. Okay. And so those action potentials are going to start moving into the ventricles at this point. Okay. So this is the third pacemaker. Okay. From there, the action potentials will start moving into the right and left bundle branches here in the interventricular septum. Okay. And then from there, the action potentials will then move into the Purkinje fibers, which are inside the ventricular walls, okay, inside the myocardium. And so that is going to give the heart its series of contractions, okay, and shows how the heart is going to be able to contract in a coordinated fashion. It's going to start here in the SA node, okay, then move into the AV node, and then from there into the bundle of His, okay, and then from there into the right and left bundle branches, and then into the Purkinje fibers along the ventricular walls. Okay. So that's the pathway that the action potentials are going to be moving and how the heart is going to be contracting. Okay. And so one thing that's going to be important for a cardiologist is to be able to determine how well a heart is contracting and which parts of the heart are contracting at a given point in time. Okay. The way you can do that is by looking at the electricity or the electric current going throughout the body. Okay. So because all these are action potentials, the electric current can actually be detected all over the body. Okay. And so this is going to be recorded using a tool called an electrocardiogram or an ECG or EKG. Okay. And so what an ECG does is it's going to read the amount of electrical activity happening throughout the body, and that will determine, or that will show you which parts of the heart are contracting at a given point in time. Okay. So this is what an EKG will look like. So on an EKG, you're going to have these electric leads that you're going to place on the patient's body, okay, in a specific manner. And if you take physiology next semester or at any point, you'll be able to do this in lab. And so you put these electric leads onto the body, and then when the heart contracts, each of these leads will be able to pick up on the electric currents at different points in time. And then from there, it will help you kind of trace what those heartbeats are looking like. Okay? And so a normal ECG trace should look something like this. So you have a P wave, you have a QRS wave, and then you'll have a T wave here. Okay? And so each of these waves will tell you a different piece of information about how the heart is contracting. Okay? And so I'll give you an example of that in a second here. But before we get there, I kind of want to explain this part here. And so you don't need to worry about writing the slide down, but this is just to kind of put the whole ECG into context. Okay? So when we're looking at an ECG, one of the first things that it's going to be measuring is the membrane potential. Okay? The membrane potential is just the difference in the voltage from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. Okay? So membrane potential, depending on the cell, is going to be negative, but a different negative number. In the heart, it's typically going to be around -70 or so. And that's just going to be saying that the heart is a lot, or the cells within the heart are going to be a lot more negative than the outside of the cells. Okay. So about -70 millivolts. And that will be the resting membrane potential, when the heart's not doing anything. Okay. From there, you're going to end up having a depolarization, which means that the resting membrane potential is going to start to increase. It's going to become less negative. It's eventually going to hit 0 and then become positive. Okay. So that's what we call a depolarization. When the membrane potential becomes a lot more positive. Okay. A depolarization is usually indicates that a contraction is happening within muscle. Okay. So after the depolarization, the next thing that we'll end up with is a repolarization. Okay. So a repolarization is going to be when the membrane potential starts to return back to resting, okay, back to -70. Okay. And so repolarizations usually tell you when a particular muscle is going to be relaxing. Okay. So as far as this, you don't need to worry about this. You'll talk about this more in physiology, but this is just to kind of put this whole EKG into context here. Okay. So an action potential is a sequence of a depolarization and then a repolarization and then a return to resting. Okay. So every time you have that sequence, you have one single action potential. Okay. Everyone kind of following me so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So again, don't worry too much about it, but this is more to kind of put this whole thing into context here. So when we're looking at an EKG, each of these waves is going to indicate a certain amount of depolarization in a specific area of the heart. Okay. So first of all, so an EKG, let me kind of step back. So an EKG gives you an indication of all the action potentials happening within the heart. So this first wave, which is called the P wave, okay, the P wave will indicate a depolarization inside the atria. Okay? So that tells you that the atria are contracting. Okay? So then after a fraction of a second, then we're going to reach the QRS wave, where it dips down, it spikes up with the R over here, and then it drops back down to the S wave. Okay? So a QRS wave will tell you that the ventricles are depolarizing, which means the ventricles are now contracting. Okay. So P wave tells you atria are contracting, and then the QRS wave tells you that the ventricles are now contracting. Okay. The last wave that we're going to see is the T wave, and so the T wave tells you that the ventricles are now repolarizing, which means now they're relaxing. Okay. So this is going to tell you when the ventricles are relaxing. So P wave tells you the atrial are contracting. The QRS wave tells you that the ventricles are contracting. And then the T wave tells you that the ventricles are relaxing here and returning back to their original positions. Okay. So if we were to look at a normal ECG, what we should see is a P wave, a QRS wave, and a T wave in that same manner. Okay. P wave, QRS wave, T wave. P wave, QRS wave, T wave. Okay. And so they should be happening at equally spaced distances and equally spaced time points from each other, because that'll tell you that the heart is beating in a normal rhythm. Okay. It's got a specific rhythm to it. Okay. Beat, 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 beat. Okay. That's what each ECG should be telling you. And you should be able to see each of those three waves, the P wave, the QRS wave, and the T wave, okay, in a normal ECG. Okay. Down here, we have an example of an abnormal ECG. And so here, we see our QRS waves, but it's very difficult to make out where the P waves are and the T waves are. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
It's very difficult to see all those waves. But what else do we notice is incorrect here or problematic here?
The distances between the QRS complexes, correct?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So the distances are not even. So just like Tamim said, the distances between all the QRS waves are not even, which means that the heartbeats are not regular. Okay, they're at an irregular spacing. Okay, so here we have a beat, then we have a long period of time before we have another beat. Okay? Then we have a short period of time, and then a very long period of time before we have the next heartbeat. Okay? Then a short period of time, and then a longer period of time before we have the next heartbeat. Okay? So the rhythm is very erratic. It's not going in any normal pattern, just like we see with the normal EKG up here. Okay? So that's number one. That's the first thing we should be able to see. Okay? We should be able to notice that the spacing between each of the heartbeats should be even. Okay? We don't see that here. Okay? The other thing that we notice is that we can't see where our P waves are and we can't see where our T waves are. Okay? And so this is called atrial fibrillation, where we're having lots of these P waves, okay, in between each of these QRS waves. So what's happening in this person's actually, can anyone have an idea of what's happening with this particular person's heart? Okay. Someone try to interpret this for me based off of what we know so far.
Is it fluttering?
So it's fluttering, right. So the atria are fluttering and they're not going in collaboration with the ventricles. Okay. So the atria are having all these little mini contractions, and then you have one ventricular contraction. Okay. And then you have a lot of these little tiny atrial contractions and then a ventricular contraction. So the atria and the ventricles are not in lockstep with each other. Okay. They should be kind of running together. They should be having a one atrial contraction and one ventricular contraction, but here they're not in correct communication with one another. Okay. So this is a problematic situation. Okay. So depending on the individual's ECG, you're going to be able to kind of diagnose what's going on with that person's heart.
So while you're there, I had
this
a quick question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know how QRS complex refers to the ventricle contraction, correct? So
yes,
just by looking at the QRS complex, could we determine which part of the ventricle is actually not functioning properly? Is it the AV, the bundle of His is not functioning properly? Is it the Purkinje fibers, or which part is actually not functioning?
Yeah, so that part you can't tell from the ECG. And so usually when a cardiologist is taking ECG, they're not usually seeing just one single read. They're seeing a total of usually about 6 different ECG reads. And so based off of all 6 of those kind of readings, they're going to be able to kind of determine where exactly the problem is. But just from one ECG, just one single read right here, you wouldn't be able to tell where exactly the problem is. Yeah, good question. Any other questions here? Yeah, so for those of you guys who couldn't hear, Tamim's question was, if you're looking at this one ECG, are you able to determine where exactly that problem is? Are you able to tell whether it's happening in the bundle of His? Is it in the AV node? Is it in the Purkinje fibers? And so based off of that, you're not going to be, based off of one single reading, you're not going to be able to tell where that is. You would need a composite of different readings. So usually about 6 to help you kind of narrow down where the problem is.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah. So on the reading, on the sides of it, it should say which lead you're looking at. So, for example,
Right.
like if you put them subclavicle, it'll be like lead like L1 or L2, something like that. So when you're reading it, that will read that area. So yeah, depending on which one you read, then that's one where you can kind of, I guess, pinpoint the trouble-ish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Josue was mentioning that with the ECG, when you're looking at a particular reading, each reading is going to have a specific lead number. So there's going to be like lead 1, lead 2, lead 3, lead 4, lead 5, lead 6. And so by looking at all the different leads, each lead is going to tell you something a little bit different, a different piece of the story, essentially, to help you make that complete diagnosis and help you figure out where exactly the problem is. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions here? All right, cool. All right, so this kind of goes back to our questions here. So artificial pacemaker. So we were looking at the SA node and the AV node, and we saw that the SA node is the normal pacemaker of the heart. Okay. Now, what happens if the SA node gets damaged? Okay. Well, the SA node gets damaged, then the next node in the chain now becomes a new pacemaker. Okay. So in this case, that would be the AV node. Okay. So if the AV node takes over as the new SA node as the new pacemaker because the SA node is damaged, we're still okay, because the AV node will generate action potentials at about 40 to 60 beats per minute, okay, which is still pretty good. Ideally, we want it's a little on the low end, but it's still good for what we need. Okay, so that's not bad. However, if there's a situation where both the SA node and the AV node are both damaged, the next node the next pacemaker now becomes the bundle of His. The problem with the bundle of His becoming the pacemaker is that it beats too slowly. And so it only beats at a rate of about 20 to 35 beats per minute, okay, which is not nearly as efficient as we need it to be. Okay, it's pumping too slow for it to be efficient for the body. So Michelle's question is if the SA node is damaged, can it be repaired? Typically, no. If it gets damaged, it's pretty much damaged for good. So we have to have a way of kind of going about this and kind of repairing this. So instead of having the bundle of His take over, instead what cardiologists will do is they'll insert an artificial pacemaker into the heart. Okay? And so this pacemaker is going to be almost like a little electrode that sits in the chest, and it's going to have 1 or 2 leads that's going to lead into the superior vena cava and then drop off right into one of the atria, usually the right atrium. Okay? And so this electrode will then be able to generate electrical impulses. Okay? And that electrical impulse that the pacemaker generates can be used as essentially the new pacemaker. Okay? And so then you're able to generate the action potentials at the appropriate rate. Okay? And so you end up having your heart beating at a normal pace. Okay? So does this make sense? Are there any questions on pacemakers and how they work?
No, we're good.
All right, so those are pacemakers. So again, they take over for the SA node or the AV node if those are damaged. Okay, cool. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the cardiac cycle and how we actually have a single heartbeat and what events happen for each heartbeat. Okay, so a cardiac cycle is all the events that happen during the course of a single heartbeat. And so during a heartbeat, normally what will happen is the atria will contract while the ventricles are relaxing. Okay? Like we saw before, when the atria are contracting, we don't want the ventricles contracting at the same time, because then now we have too much pressure going on within the heart. Okay? So the atria contracts while the ventricles relax, and then the ventricles will contract while the atria relax. Okay? And that allows efficient flow of blood throughout the heart, and then eventually into our vasculature. Okay? So whenever we have a chamber of the heart contracting, we call that phase systole. Okay? And then whenever that chamber is relaxing, we call that diastole. Okay? So systole is when we have contraction in the chamber. Diastole is when we have relaxation in that chamber. Okay? So we're going to take a look at how this is going to work here. And so the first phase that we're going to look at is the relaxation period. Okay? So during the relaxation period, both the atria and both ventricles are all going to be in diastole. Okay? All of them are going to be relaxing. Okay? As they all relax, that's going to allow all 4 of those chambers to fill with blood. Okay? And so while that's happening, Okay? The AV valves, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves, okay? These guys are both going to be open, which is going to allow blood to flow from the atria into the ventricles and so on and so forth. Okay? Okay. At the same time, the semilunar valves, our pulmonary valve and our aortic valve, are both going to be closed. Okay? So that's the relaxation period. They're just all filling with blood. Nothing is contracting at this point. Okay. The next phase, the next period is called atrial systole. And so this is going to be where the atria begin to contract. Okay? And so when the atria contract, they're going to push blood through the AV valves, okay, through the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Okay? So those valves are going to remain open. And at the same time, the semilunar valves are going to remain closed. Okay? And so that blood is going to end up getting pushed into the ventricles. Okay? So atria contracting and pushing blood into the ventricles through the AV valves. Okay? Again, the semilunar valves are both closed here. Okay? The third phase is going to be ventricular systole. So this is where the ventricles begin to contract. Okay? So when the ventricles contract, the pressure inside the ventricles causes some of that blood to push backward, okay, towards the atria. Okay? When that blood pushes backward, it closes up the cusps of the AV valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, and it forces those valves shut, so we don't have any backflow of blood into the atria. Okay? So there's going to be a short period of time where both the AV valves and both semilunar valves are both going to be closed. And so that's going to cause the pressure within the ventricles to continue to increase. Okay? So when the ventricles continue to contract, okay, during that time, the pressure is going to continue increasing, and eventually you're going to reach a threshold where you're going to push open the semilunar valves, okay, pushing open the pulmonary valve as well as the aortic valves. Okay? And that's going to cause the blood to eject out of the heart and then into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Okay? When the ventricles begin to relax at that point, okay, blood is going to start to flow back a little bit, and that's going to close up these semilunar valves and prevent backflow of blood into the two ventricles. Okay, and then the last thing that's going to happen is once this guy continues to contract, or sorry, when the ventricles begin to relax, okay, now there's going to be a short period of time where both the atria and the ventricles are now relaxing, and now we're back in the relaxation period. Okay. So that's going to be the contraction cycle. So starting with the relaxation cycle, everything is relaxing and blood is just kind of flowing in passively, okay, while the AV valves are both open and the semilunar valves are closed. Okay. Then the atria begin to contract, and when they contract, they're going to push blood through the AV valves into the ventricles. And then from there, we have ventricular systole, where both ventricles contract. And when they contract, they close up the AV valves, and the pressure continues to rise, and then blood gets end up pushing through the semilunar valves, through the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve to eject blood out. Okay. So that is the cardiac cycle. Okay. So then one of the last few things we're going to be talking about here is the heart sounds. Okay. So you've probably been to a doctor and they will take the stethoscope and they'll listen to your heart and see how well they're able to hear your heart sounds. Okay. So the process of listening to sounds inside the body is called auscultation. And like I said, it's going to be usually done with a stethoscope. Okay. So when we think about hearing our heart sounds, we're usually going to hear a bump, 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 or a lub, dub, 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 dub. So those sounds that you hear whenever your heart beats is going to be due to your valves closing, okay, due to the AV valves and the semilunar valves closing. Okay. And so kind of getting into a little bit of physics here, when fluids start to move in a normal manner, in a straight line manner, it doesn't create any tension, any force. There's no turbulence. Everything's just moving smoothly, so you don't get any sounds. Okay. However, when the heart valves close, it causes some turbulence in the blood. Okay. And so instead of moving in a straight line path, the blood ends up moving in more of a turbulent manner. Okay. And that's what creates the heart sounds. Okay. So the first sound that you hear, which is called S1, or the lub sound, the louder and longer sound, that is caused by the blood turbulence when the AV valves close. So when your bicuspid and your tricuspid valves close, that's going to create that first heart sound, the bump, that first long heart sound. Okay. And so that's going to happen when the ventricles contract. Okay. So when the ventricles contract, you're going to close up the AV valves, and that's when you hear the S1 sound. Okay. The second sound that you hear, which is a little bit shorter and softer, is going to be caused by the semilunar valves closing, okay, whenever the ventricles begin to relax. So when they relax, the semilunar valves, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve are going to close, and that's going to cause that second sound that you hear. Okay. And so usually it's a little bit easier to hear those sounds whenever you put a stethoscope away from the actual area of those valves for some physics reasons I don't really understand. Okay. Okay. So those are the heart sounds. Okay. Last thing here is we're talking about exercise. So exercise has the ability to improve your cardiovascular fitness. Okay. And so what happens here is the more you perform aerobic exercise like running and lots of exercise that actually causes your heart to actually do lots of work, it increases a kind of measurement of your heart called your cardiac output. Okay. And so cardiac output is the amount of blood that you're able to eject from the heart eject from your ventricles every minute. And so the more exercise you're able to do, the more blood your heart is going to be able to pump with every single beat, okay? Or per minute, I should say. Okay. And so typically that's going to be something that's going to develop as you start to work out or exercise 3 to 5 times a week. Okay. And so the more you train, the more you exercise, the more your maximal cardiac output becomes. Okay. And so typically your cardiac output should be about 5 liters per minute. Okay. And so the more exercise you're able to do, you end up with what's called physiological cardiomegaly. Okay. And so what that means is your heart just increases in muscle mass just because it's used to doing that extra work, okay, in order to help you do the type of exercise you're able to do. Okay. And so that's a good type of heart enlargement that we want. Okay, and there's a specific limit on that, but there's a specific that helps it to improve your cardiac output. Okay. There's a second type of cardiomegaly that's called pathological cardiomegaly, which is one that you don't want. That's usually due to some cardiovascular disease, either something going on in the heart or something going on in your blood vessels or something going on in the blood that makes it a little bit thicker than it should be. Okay. So pathological cardiomegaly is when your heart is kind of forced to do extra work, so it develops more muscle, okay, in order to kind of just push blood at a normal pace. And so people who usually have heart diseases will typically have enlarged hearts, sometimes up to twice the size of their fists. So that's one thing that we don't want to have happen. But physiological cardiomegaly is something that's normal, something that we do want to have happen. Okay. So in addition to increasing your cardiac output, exercise also helps from a cardiovascular perspective in terms of reducing your blood pressure. So as a result, your heart, when it beats, it doesn't need to beat as hard in order to pump blood where it needs to go. And then it also has the ability to dissolve any blood clots as well. Okay. And then away from cardiovascular issues, the exercise also helps with reducing anxiety and depression, and then also helps with controlling weight. And then controlling that weight also helps to reduce the strain on your heart as well. Okay. Any questions on anything we've covered so far?
No, we're good.
No, all good? Okay. All right, so with that, a couple questions. So in the figure shown, which component of the cardiac conduction system is indicated? Is this the Purkinje fibers, the right and left bundle branches, the AV valve, the AV bundle, the bundle of His, the AV node, or the SA node?
SA node.
A node.
Yeah, so this would be the SA node, the sinoatrial node. Perfect. So that is going to be the normal pacemaker of the heart. Beautiful. Okay, so next question. So the first heart sound, S1, described as a lub sound, is caused by blood turbulence associated with the closure of which valves shown in the figure? Okay, is this going to be the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, the tricuspid and pulmonary valves, bicuspid and aortic valves, pulmonary and aortic valves, or all the valves closed at the same time to produce that sound?
Tricuspid and bicuspid valves.
Tricuspid and bicuspid, do we agree with that one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Going once, going twice.
Yeah. Here we go. Yeah, exactly. So the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. Okay. So remember the S1 sound is going to be made by the AV valves closing, which are your tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Which ones would contribute to the S2 sound?
The tricuspid and the pulmonary. Isn't it pulmonary?
Not the tricuspid and pulmonary.
It's the pulmonary and the aortic valve.
Yeah, D.
Right. Yeah, D. So the pulmonary and the aortic valves. So For the S2 sound, that would be the semilunar valves closing, so the pulmonary and aortic valves. For the S1 sound, you would have the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Perfect. All right, cool. So that is the heart. So to study the heart, one of the things I would suggest doing is trying to draw out the pathway of the circulation, the two types of circulations, the systemic and the pulmonary circulations, and also be comfortable with, the cardiac conduction system as well. Cool. All right, so that is chapter 13. So that one's out of the way. Perfect. So the next one is chapter 14, which covers our blood vessels. Okay. Is everyone able to see the blood vessels slideshow now?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so the last component of the cardiovascular system are the blood vessels. Okay, so for today, what we're going to be taking a look at is kind of the basic structure of blood vessels. We're going to be looking at the 5 major types of blood vessels and what they're able to do. We're going to be looking at the systemic and pulmonary circulation and their importance. And then we're going to look at specific blood vessels in the body and where exactly they're going to be directing blood to. Okay. So that is the game plan for today. So when we look at blood vessels, kind of in our analogy of our roadways here, the blood vessels are going to act as the roadways that are going to be directing the blood to their destination. Okay. So we're going to be taking oxygenated blood to a specific region of the body. Once we get it to that particular region, okay, then that blood is going to kind of make a U-turn and it's going to return back to the heart. Okay, and so we're going to be looking at how blood is going to be able to be moving through our blood vessels here. Okay. So again, the role of the major importance for these blood vessels is to help deliver oxygen and nutrients to a specific region, okay, and then pick up carbon dioxide and wastes. Okay. The blood is going to be the actual carrier, the actual guy who's delivering the nutrients and taking up the waste, but it's going to be traveling through the blood vessels in order to get to their destinations. Okay. So this circular pattern, okay, of blood moving to a specific location and then coming back to the heart is what we refer to as the vascular component of the cardiovascular system, okay, or the vasculature. Okay. So, quick question here. And so this one we talked about a little bit over the course of the semester, but we haven't really kind of nailed it down so far. Okay. So, question says the blood vessels responsible for conveying blood away from the heart are arteries, veins, both, or neither? What do we think?
Veins.
Veins. B.
So this is a situation here. So it's not veins.
I'll say it's arteries.
The arteries, right. So arteries are always responsible for carrying blood away from the heart. So sometimes people will kind of, there's a couple misconceptions here. So number one is people will typically think of arteries as always carrying oxygenated blood, okay, which isn't always the case. So if you remember looking at the pulmonary circulation from Monday, the pulmonary arteries actually move deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle away from the heart and to the lungs. Okay? So pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood, while other arteries throughout the body will also carry oxygenated blood. Okay? So that's not a good way to think about it as far as oxygenation versus deoxygenation. Okay? And the same thing with veins. Sometimes people consider veins as always carrying deoxygenated blood, which again isn't always the case, because with the pulmonary veins, they're going to be directing oxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay, so veins do not always carry deoxygenated blood. Arteries do not always carry oxygenated blood. Okay, the way to help you remember this is that arteries. Let me kind of draw this out here. So arteries will always carry blood away from the heart. Away. Boom, sorry. So arteries will always carry blood away from the heart, and then veins will always carry blood towards the heart. Okay. So keep that one in mind. Don't get yourself mixed up, because this is going to be one that's going to be very, very important going forward. Okay. So arteries always carry blood away from the heart. So A and A always together. Cool.
What about pulmonary?
Okay, everyone cool so far? Sorry, was there a question?
Yes, I heard.
What about pulmonary vein?
So pulmonary veins will carry oxygenated blood, but they'll carry it towards the heart. So in any case, veins are always going towards the heart, while arteries will always go away from the heart. Okay? So pulmonary veins will take blood from the lungs and bring it back to the heart. The systemic veins going throughout the rest of your body systems will always carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay? So again, you can't really think about it in terms of oxygenation, but in any case, veins will always go back to the heart, while arteries will always go away from the heart. And then this will make more sense when we kind of get to the end of the lecture as well. Cool. Okay.
Perfect.
So I'm going to clear this out here. Okay. Oops. Okay, cool. Okay. So when we're looking at blood vessels, we have 5 major types of blood vessels. Okay, so we're going to have our arteries, we're going to have arterioles, then we have capillaries, venules, and veins. Okay, typically found in that order, coming from the heart and then returning back to the heart. And so we're going to take a look at all 5 of those blood vessels in a little more detail going forward here. But before we get there, there's going to be 3 layers to all of our blood vessels, okay, typically, with the exception of one of them. So those 3 layers are going to be the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. Okay. So the tunica interna is going to be the innermost layer of your blood vessels. Okay. And so this is going to be made up of endothelium, okay, which is the same material that the chambers of the heart are also made out of. Okay. Okay. So that's going to be the inner lining of your blood vessels. Okay. The second layer, just superficial to that, is the tunica media. And so the tunica media is going to be made up of smooth muscle, as well as a little bit of elastic connective tissue as well. And then the outer layer is called the tunica externa. Okay? And so that's the outermost layer, mainly made of connective tissue. Okay. All right, so we're going to take a look at these in a little more detail here. But before we get there, we have this picture of an artery on the left, and then a vein on the right. Okay. What do we notice about the artery and the vein and how they're different?
So arteries have, I guess, thicker musculature compared to the veins.
So thicker vasculature as opposed to veins. So I'll change one word out of that. So it's going to have a thicker wall, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to have a thicker wall than the veins do. So that's exactly what we see. So here we have our tunica interna. Here we have our tunica media. And then here we have our tunica externa, okay, for the artery. So we can see it's a very thick wall in comparison to the vein, okay, where we have the tunica interna here, we have a very thin tunica media here, and then a tunica externa right here. Okay. So we're going to see that the walls are going to be a lot thinner in veins than they are in arteries. Cool, good to me. What else do we notice? This is one other thing I want you guys to notice here.
Is it something to do with the extracellular matrix, or?
Not the cellular matrix, but someone else had said it, the lumen.
The lumen,
the lumen.
Much larger.
Right. So in veins, the lumen is a lot larger than in arteries. Okay. So the lumen, if we kind of think about it, is that open space in the inside of your blood vessel. So if you imagine kind of cutting your blood vessel and then looking right down the barrel of it, that barrel, the middle part would be the lumen. So the lumen in veins is going to be significantly larger than the lumen in arteries. So that's going to be one way that you're able to determine you're looking at an artery versus looking at a vein. Okay, cool. Okay, then we take a look at the capillary. And one thing that we mentioned from the capillaries on Monday is that capillaries are about the same diameter as that of a red blood cell. So for that reason, red blood cells have to pass through capillaries essentially in a single file line because that's all that can fit through a single capillary. Okay. So we'll take a look at all of those in a little more detail here. But before we get there, we're going to look more specifically at the layers of the blood vessels. Okay. So this first layer is the tunica interna. And so the tunica interna is the innermost layer. And so that's the part of the blood vessel that's going to make direct contact with blood as it comes through. Okay. So that's going to make up the interior portion of the blood vessel. Okay. The tunica interna is going to be made up of endothelium, and so that's going to be the same tissue that lines the majority of the cardiovascular system. Okay. So the thing about the endothelium that's really helpful is that it's very smooth. Okay? And so because it's so smooth, it allows blood to be able to move through pretty efficiently without without any like significant turbulence. Okay. And then there's also some chemical mediators that are going to determine how the tunica interna is going to be contracted or relaxed, okay, to a lesser degree, but not so much. Okay. So in addition to the endothelium, which we see over here in this diagram here, we also have what's called the internal elastic lamina. Okay. So the internal elastic lamina is this portion right over here. And so that is going to be made up of lots of elastic fibers. Okay. And so because there's lots of elastic fibers, there's going to be a little bit of holes in there that's going to allow nutrients and different materials to move between the tunica interna and the tunica media. Okay. So that's going to allow a little bit of communication, a little bit of transmitting and diffusion of materials from one layer into the next one. Okay. Okay, so that is the tunica interna. The next layer is the tunica media. And so the tunica media is pretty large in both arteries and veins in comparison to the other two layers, the tunica interna and the tunica externa. Okay. So this region, this layer here, is going to be made up of smooth muscle, okay, and as well as some elastic fibers. Okay. So because it's made of smooth muscle, this is going to determine the diameter of your lumen. It's going to determine whether your blood vessel is more constricted or more dilated. Okay. And so because it's able to determine the size of the blood vessel, it's going to be responsible for regulating your blood pressure. Okay. In order to do that, we're going to have some sympathetic fibers coming from the nervous system that are going to dictate the contractile state of the blood vessel and what the smooth muscle in the tunica media is going to be doing. Okay. So when we have increased sympathetic stimulation, which is your fight or flight mode, okay, so when you're in fight or flight where you have increased sympathetic stimulation, you're going to have more vasoconstriction. Okay. So that's going to be where your diameter of your blood vessel begins to constrict and becomes smaller. Okay. So that's going to be where the smooth muscle begins to constrict there. Okay. Now, when you're not in your fight or flight mode, you're going to have decreased sympathetic stimulation. And so that's going to cause your blood vessel to now dilate. Okay. That's going to be where your smooth muscle begins to relax, okay, causing that vasodilation. Okay. So vasoconstriction is going to be where you have your blood vessel constricting. Vasodilation is where you have the blood vessel dilating. Okay. Now, between vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which one do you think would be associated with an increase in blood pressure? Would it be vasoconstriction or vasodilation?
Constriction.
Vasodilation.
So for blood pressure increase, that would be vasoconstriction. Okay. And so the way you can kind of think about that is if you were to take like a rubber hose, for example, right? And you started running water, you turn on the faucet, you let water start to run through it. If you shrunk the size of that hose, okay, and you still have the same amount of water running through that hose, you're gonna have the water exerting more pressure on the walls of the hose. Okay. Same thing is going to be the case for the blood vessels. Okay. So what happens is when the blood vessels constrict, you still have the same amount of blood running through it, but because they have a smaller area, they're going to exert more pressure on the walls of your artery, okay, or blood vessel in this case. Okay. And so by increasing that pressure on the walls of the artery, that is going to increase your blood pressure. Okay. Now, when you cause vasodilation, okay, and you cause the vessels to now dilate, again, you stop the same amount of blood running through it, but there's going to be less pressure on the walls because there's more room for all the blood to run through. Okay. So there's going to be a smaller blood pressure, a lower blood pressure with that. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So vasoconstriction gives you an increased blood pressure. Vasodilation gives you a reduced blood pressure. Okay. So then we have this last component, which is the tunica externa, which is this region over here, also sometimes called the tunica adventitia. And so this is going to be made up of mostly elastic fibers and collagen fibers. This particular region doesn't do nearly as much as the tunica media does, but it does contain some nerves, and it does contain some tiny blood vessels that will supply the tunica externa itself. Okay. And so those tiny little blood vessels we refer to as vasa vasorum, or also kind of translates to vessels to the vessels. Okay? So this blood vessel, okay, is going to have specific blood vessels that will supply it and keep it nice and healthy, and that's going to be found inside the tunica externa. Okay? So they're kind of like blood vessels within blood vessels here. Okay? And so the role of the tunica externa is to make sure, is to anchor the blood vessel to any surrounding tissue. Okay, kind of holds it in place to the tissue it's supposed to be bound to. Okay. So those are the three layers of the blood vessels. Okay. Any questions on those three layers here?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so question here. So in the figure shown, what is indicated? Are we looking at the tunica externa, tunica media, tunica interna, the lumen, or a valve?
Tunica media.
I'm hearing tunica media. Do we agree with this one?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the tunica media, right? So tunica media is going to be this middle region, and that is going to be the part that actually regulates your the contractile state of your blood vessel. You can determine whether it's vasoconstricted or vasodilated. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some of the specifics of these vessels here. And so before we get to elastic arteries, there's one thing I want to mention here, and that is that arteries as a whole are going to have what's called high compliance. Okay, what that means is that if there's an increase in pressure, even just a little bit of an increase in pressure, those arteries have the ability to stretch in order to accommodate that small increase in pressure. Okay, so they're able to stretch quite a bit here. So that's a good thing that we want to have our arteries be able to do. Okay, and they're able to stretch without tearing, okay, which is good. Okay. Other vessels are not going to have high compliance. So those would specifically be the veins, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But arteries will have high compliance, so they'll be able to stretch in order to accommodate different amounts of pressure, okay, without tearing. Okay. So the first set of arteries we're going to be taking a look at here are the elastic arteries. Okay, so the elastic arteries are the arteries that have the largest diameter in the of all of the arteries here. Okay. And so they have a very, very thick tunica media, and then relatively thin walls in comparison to the rest of those arteries. Okay. They will also have what's called an elastic lamella or lamellae, which means that they're going to have just a lot of elastic fibers in the heart. Okay. Or sorry, in those vessels here. And so the three main sets of elastic arteries are going to be the aorta, okay, which we see right here. Okay. The pulmonary trunk is going to be the other one, and then all the branches coming off of the aorta as well. Okay. The three major branches of the aorta. Okay. So those are the three sets of elastic arteries. Okay. The way these elastic arteries are going to work is by accommodating lots of pressure. Okay. And so the role of these arteries is to be able to propel blood with a good amount of force, with a lot of force throughout the vasculature. Okay. So this is going to be happening when the ventricles are relaxing. So the way this is going to work is when the ventricles contract, they're going to be pushing blood with a high amount of pressure into these elastic arteries. So we'll use the aorta as an example. Okay. So we're going to be pushing a large surge of blood into the aorta. And then for a split second, the aorta is going to expand because of its elastic fibers in order to accommodate that very large surge of blood. Okay? And it's going to just hold it there for just a split second. Okay? So we call that acting as a pressure reservoir, because it's just holding lots of pressure within that particular part of the aorta or that particular vessel. Okay? After that split second, the fibers inside of the aorta are going to recoil. And when they recoil, they're going to push the blood out and then into the rest of your vasculature. Okay? And so you end up storing that, or converting that potential energy inside your vessels into kinetic energy where you actually move the heart. Okay? So this is essentially what it looks like here. So when the ventricles first contract, okay, the aorta is going to expand and hold that there for a little bit. Okay? And then once they recoil, it's going to squeeze the blood and push it into the rest of your vasculature. Okay? So the role of the elastic arteries is to help push blood throughout the body. Okay. And so for that reason, we call these conducting arteries, because they're going to be conducting blood to different places in the body. Okay. So those are elastic arteries. The second type of artery are called the muscular arteries. So these arteries are more medium-sized. They have tunica media that has much more smooth muscle than the elastic arteries do, but they have much less elastic fibers. Okay? And so because they have some more smooth muscle, they're going to be better able to vasoconstrict and then vasodilate as well. Okay? And so their job is to just kind of distribute the blood and move the blood to their destination. Okay? So for that reason, they're kind of nicknamed the distributing arteries, because they're just distributing blood to its destination. Okay? Now, because there's not a whole lot of elastic tissue, these vessels do not have the ability to recoil back. Okay? They don't recoil at all. And so their job is not to propel blood. Their job is to just move the blood and facilitate it to wherever it's supposed to be going. Okay? So for that reason, it's going to have a little bit of vascular tone, a little bit of kind of stiffness to that vessel. That's going to be important to help to maintain your blood pressure and then maintain efficient blood flow throughout the body. Okay. So these are the muscular arteries. Okay. Any questions on elastic versus muscular arteries before we go forward here?
No.
Okay. All righty, cool. Yeah. Is there a question? Okay. All right. So with that being said, there is a condition called hypertension. And so this is going to be due to high blood pressure inside usually the muscular arteries. Okay? So normal blood pressure should be about 120/80. Okay? So what those numbers mean is that when your heart is in systole, or when your ventricles are contracting, the pressure inside your muscular arteries should be about 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Then when your heart is relaxing, it should be about 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay? So that is your normal blood pressure. Okay? Now, if your blood pressure begins to rise to about anywhere from 120 to 139/80 to 89, okay, that is going to give you the condition called prehypertension, which means you're kind of in that middle area. You're kind of in a slippery slope, so you can either slip into hypertension, or if you kind of modify your lifestyle, you can kind of get yourself back into the normal category. Okay. But if you start going into the opposite direction, into the bad direction, keep continuing to have that blood pressure rise, you end up having with stage 1 hypertension, which is where your blood pressure becomes 140 to 159/90 to 99. And then if it goes higher than that, it can get to stage 2 hypertension, where things get really dangerous. Okay, so this is where your blood pressure is over 160/100. Okay, so this is usually pretty bad, because this will usually lead to strokes and things like that, which we don't want to have happen. Okay, so your normal blood pressure should be 120/80, or something a little bit less than that. So there's 2 types of hypertension that we can develop. The first type is called primary hypertension. And so primary hypertension is where you have an elevated blood pressure, but you can't figure out where or why exactly it's happening. You can't give it an identifiable cause. Okay, so we call that primary hypertension. The other type of hypertension that people can develop is called secondary hypertension. And so secondary hypertension is where you have a high blood pressure, but it's due to something else. Okay, so for example, kidney diseases can lead to secondary hypertension. Okay, so you have hypertension that's due to the kidney problems you're developing. I'm trying to think of another one off the top of my head, but I think that's the main one. Sometimes lung issues can cause, or respiratory issues can cause hypertension as well. Okay, so those would be, that would be hypertension secondary to kidney problems or respiratory problems or any other problem like that. Okay, so ideally we want to keep our blood pressure at 120/80. If not, that blood pressure now becomes, we're not classified as hypertensive. Okay. All right, so that's blood pressure. Okay, so we talked about anastomoses a little bit in the heart on Monday, but we have anastomoses not just in the heart, but we have them throughout the body. Okay? And so anastomoses, if you remember, are separate pathways of blood vessels to get to the same location, almost like a detour. Okay? So most tissues in the body are going to have access to blood vessels from more than one specific artery. And the reason for that is if one artery gets blocked, okay, that way you're not kind of screwed over and that you have no way of getting blood to that particular area. Okay, so for example, let's say we were looking at my kidneys. If there's only one artery that was responsible for supplying my kidneys with oxygen and nutrients, if that one artery got blocked, I would end up in renal failure, and that would be, all bad. Okay? or bones or muscles or things like that. Okay. But we have multiple different blood vessels to get to a specific region of the body or a specific tissue. So that way, if one blood vessel gets blocked, you have other ways of delivering oxygen and nutrients to that particular tissue. Okay. So those alternate routes to a particular part of the body through an anastomosis is called collateral circulation. Okay. So collateral circulation is all the different types of blood vessels that are all going to a specific region or a specific tissue. Okay, so those are anastomoses. Okay, so that's all arteries. Okay. Any questions on arteries before we go forward here?
Nope.
No? Okay, cool. All right, so now the next things that we're going to be taking a look at here are the arterioles. Okay, so the arteries are going to feed into these smaller arteries called arterioles. Okay. So in these arterioles here, we're going to find fewer layers of smooth muscle. So there's going to be about 1 to 2 layers of smooth muscle, and they're going to be arranged more circularly rather than in a longitudinal manner. No need to worry too much about it, but just know there's 1 to 2 layers of smooth muscle there. Okay. So that would be this guy right over here. Okay. Now each arteriole is going to have a little branch coming off it called a metarteriole. Okay, that's going to be this end portion here, and this metarteriole is going to lead into a capillary bed. So it's going to kind of taper around the junction between that artery and a capillary. Okay. So these arterioles are going to kind of act as precapillary sphincters. And so these precapillary sphincters that we see over here are going to be these little pieces of muscle that are going to regulate how much blood is able to enter that particular capillary bed. Okay. And so when we have vasoconstriction, okay, vasoconstriction is going to cause blood flow into that capillary bed to be reduced, okay, because again, you're constricting how much blood is able to go into that area. When you have vasodilation, that is going to allow an increased amount of blood flow to that particular capillary bed. Okay. And then to a lesser degree, this also alters your blood pressure as well. Okay. All right, cool. So this is what it would look like here. So here we have our precapillary sphincters that are relaxed and open. And so because they're relaxed and open, we're going to have blood be able to flow through this capillary bed until it reaches the end here. Okay. Now, if we have precapillary sphincters that are closed and contracted, that is going to force the blood down right through the middle through what's called a thoroughfare channel. It'll move just through this one vessel and then eventually reach the venule at the end of this whole capillary bed. Okay. And so you don't get any blood flow to the majority of your capillary. Okay. And that's going to be, again, be due to the precapillary sphincters being contracted and closed.
All right.
Okay. So yeah.
So
Is there a question?
Any effects on you?
No? Okay. So then the next vessel is our capillaries. And so the capillaries are going to be very, very important. And so capillaries are going to be this very extensive network of blood vessels that are going to be scattered all throughout the body. Okay. And so we call this the microcirculation. And so the microcirculation is going to be made up of all the blood vessels in between a metarteriole from the into the capillaries and then up until the postcapillary venule. Okay. So all of these little miniature blood vessels here would be considered the microcirculation. Okay. So the thing about capillaries that's really cool is that capillaries are going to be found in pretty much every tissue in the body. And in fact, they're also going to be found pretty much near every single cell of the body. So every cell is going to have access to a capillary, okay, which is going to be important. I'm going to explain why in a second here. Okay. And so the tissues that have very high metabolic activity, okay, are going to have a lot more capillaries available to them than tissues that don't have as much metabolic activity. Okay. So for example, if we're comparing, your muscles to your skin, okay, your muscles are going to have a lot more metabolic activity. Okay. They're going to be doing a lot more stuff, okay, than the skin is going to be able to do. And so for that reason, the muscles have to have a lot more capillaries available to them than the skin. Okay, so the skin won't have as much capillaries compared to the muscles. Okay, okay. So that is that there. Okay, so now the reason that it's important that every cell has access to a capillary is because the capillaries are the only blood vessel that is able to transfer oxygen and nutrients and then pick up carbon dioxide and waste. Okay, these are the only blood vessels capable of exchanging materials between the blood and a tissue. Okay, the reason for that is because the capillaries do not have a tunica media and they do not have a tunica externa. Okay, the only thing they have is that tunica interna that's going to be made up of endothelial tissue. Okay, the cool thing about this endothelial tissue is that it's basically just a set of squamous cells, simple squamous cells. And so for that reason, because they're very flat, very thin cells, oxygen and nutrients are going to be able to move from the blood into or through the endothelial cells and into your body's tissues very, very easily. Okay? And then you're also going to be able to pick up carbon dioxide and waste very easily as well. Okay? So that is going to be very, very important. That's one thing I want you to be comfortable with for the exam as well. Okay? So capillaries are the only cells, or the only blood vessels that are able to transfer nutrients and oxygen and gases across the vessels. Arteries can't do it. Arterioles can't do it. Veins can't do it either. Okay, and venules can do it to a smaller degree, which we'll talk about in a second. But the capillaries are the only ones that are able to really deliver all those nutrients, and that's going to be because they do not have the tunica media or the tunica externa around them. Okay, so that is important. Does that one make sense before we go forward here?
Yes.
That's a big.
Can you just repeat the first part of what you said again so I can write it down?
Yeah. So capillaries, they're responsible for transferring oxygen and nutrients, okay, to your tissues and picking up carbon dioxide and waste to your tissues. Okay, they're the only blood vessel that's going to be able to do that because they do not have that tunica media or the tunica externa around it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so there's going to be very easy exchange of those materials across the membrane.
Mostly because it's made of squamous cells?
Yeah, because it's made of basically just simple squamous epithelium here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, these endothelial cells are just a type of simple squamous epithelium. Okay. Okay, I think that was that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the thing that's important about that is that every single cell is going to have access to a capillary. And again, that's going to be due to the fact that these guys are the only ones that are going to be able to transmit or transfer those materials across the membrane. Okay. So when we're looking at a capillary bed is going to be a network of capillaries ranging from anywhere from as little as 10 capillaries to as many as 100 capillaries, all coming from a single metarteriole like we see over here. Okay. And again, the precapillary sphincters are going to determine the amount of blood coming through that capillary. Okay. So, because there's very extensive branching inside the capillary beds, because we have so many capillaries within that capillary bed, that is going to increase the surface area of that particular capillary bed. Okay. With a higher surface area, that's going to allow you to be able to pass nutrients and oxygen and be able to basically pass those materials a lot faster. Okay. Yes, that's going to be another thing that's important there. Oh, one last thing that's not mentioned here, but is also kind of important. Because the blood vessels, because these capillaries are only as large as the red blood cells themselves, these red blood cells have to move through in a single file line. Okay? Because they're moving in a single file line, that is going to cause them to move very slowly through those capillaries. And that is going to be really important because if a red blood cell is moving really fast, okay, it's not going to be able to deliver oxygen as efficiently to your tissues. So for example, you kind of think about it, I wish I was in lectures, I could explain this a little bit easier. But basically, the slower you move, okay, you're taking your time with delivering those nutrients. Okay? The slower you move, the more oxygen you can deliver. Okay, so instead of it kind of moving across the screen here, if I move slowly, I can deliver oxygen, 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 boom, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 oxygen molecules, all in that small little time period, okay, in that small space. But if I'm moving fast, okay, I can only deliver 1, 2, 3, okay? So I'm only able to deliver a few oxygen molecules at a time if I'm moving quickly. So red blood cells moving slowly through the capillaries is very important because it's going to be able to maximize the amount of oxygen and nutrients you're able to deliver and the amount of carbon dioxide and waste that you're able to pick up as well. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so that's the last thing I wanted to mention there. So question at the bottom here. So if we have a highly active tissue, would these capillary beds be mostly open or mostly closed? What do we think?
Think open.
Right, they're going to be mostly open. Why would we want our capillary beds to be mostly open here in a highly active tissue?
Because of the activity going on.
To distribute the oxygen and nutrients.
They're using a lot of
Exactly.
metabolic activity. High.
Exactly. So you guys all kind of got it. So the more metabolic activity that you have, okay, the more oxygen and nutrients you're going to need to make sure that that tissue is able to do what it needs to do. Okay. So for example, if you're on a stationary bicycle, for example, and you're riding really fast, okay, those capillary beds are going to, in your leg muscles are going to be more open than, for example, the capillary beds in your arms, okay, because your arms are not going to be doing anything. Okay. So the capillary beds in your arms are going to be mostly closed, while the capillary beds in your legs are going to be mostly open while you're riding a stationary bike, for example. Okay.
That's very strategic.
Yeah, extremely strategic, which is incredible that the body's able to kind of figure this whole thing out.
Yeah.
Really is.
So Michelle's question, so then it's a good thing that blood moves slowly. Yes, so it's a very good thing that blood moves slowly in the capillaries. Okay. Yeah, perfect.
Isn't that the same
Any
concept?
questions on capillaries here?
I was gonna say,
yeah.
Isn't that the same concept as to, like, when you have like a Thanksgiving meal and pretty much your body closes, or all your blood goes to your stomach to digest?
Yes, absolutely. So what he was mentioning is the same thing when you're digesting like a Thanksgiving meal, right? So when you're digesting a Thanksgiving meal, okay, your stomach is going to be the one, and the rest of your GI tract are going to be the guys that are going to be operating and more metabolically active. So the majority of your capillaries inside your GI tract is going to be open. So your capillary beds are going to be open there. Versus the rest of your body, like your muscles, for example, those ones are going to be mostly closed because they're not going to be doing anything. Okay, they're just going to be sitting around while your GI tract is doing all the work. Okay, they're metabolically active, so those capillaries are going to be more open. Cool. Yeah, very good connection there. Really good. Cool. All right. Any other questions here?
No. I don't think so.
No.
All right. Cool. So then the next vessels here coming out of the capillaries are going to be the venules. Okay? And so the venules are going to be these blood vessels that are going to drain blood out of the capillaries. Okay? So while we're in the capillaries, we're going to be distributing oxygen to those different tissues and then picking up carbon dioxide. So this is the point where our blood now becomes deoxygenated, okay? Inside the end parts of your capillaries. Then those capillaries are going to lead into these venules, which are going to start to return that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay, and so post-capillary venules are going to start to return that blood back to the heart. These are also going to be pretty porous, and so they also, to a lesser degree than the capillaries, are going to be able to exchange some last-minute nutrients and wastes, and they're also going to allow some white blood cell emigration as well. Okay, but not that much compared to the capillaries. So just like the arterioles, there's also going to be about 1 to 2 layers of smooth muscle inside the venules. And they're going to start to increase in size as you start to move closer to the heart. Okay. So those are the venules there. And then from the venules, we will eventually reach the veins. Okay. And so the veins, like we saw earlier, are these blood vessels that have a very large lumen and very, very thin walls, okay, comparative to their lumen here. And so they're going to have the same 3 layers, same tunica interna, tunica media, and tunica externa, but they're just going to be significantly thinner than that of an artery of a comparable size. These guys, on the other hand, do not have any elastic lamina. And so for that reason, they're not going to be able to stretch. Okay, so they can't withstand high pressures. They have very low compliance in comparison to the arteries. Okay? So if they end up taking lots of fluid pressure, they're not going to be able to withstand that pressure without tearing. Cool. Okay. So those are the veins. Okay, nothing too crazy about those guys, but again, those guys are the ones that will be returning blood back to the heart. Okay. All right. So then within the veins, there's a specific structure that makes these guys really special, and these are valves. Okay. So these valves are typically only going to be present inside the lower extremities, although they can be found in a few other places. But they're going to look, very similar to the tricuspid and bicuspid valves in the heart. Okay? And they're going to work pretty much the same way. Okay? So they're going to be these thin folds of the tunica interna, okay, that are going to kind of form these little flaps here. So here we have some valves, and here we have some more valves. Okay? So just like in the heart, the role of the valves here is to make sure that blood doesn't flow backwards. Okay? And so like I said, this is going to be really, really important, specifically in the legs. Okay? The reason for this is because blood flow is going to be really slow going through the veins. Okay, so it's going to take the valves out of the equation for now, and we'll just kind of think about what would be happening here. So when the heart contracts, it's going to be pushing blood with a lot of pressure through the arteries, through the arterioles, and through the capillaries. Okay? By the time it gets to the venules and the veins, okay, there's very little pressure to help bring the blood back to the heart. Okay? So for that reason, blood flow is going to be really, really slow in comparison to where it was earlier in the vasculature. Okay. So especially in the lungs, that's going to be a bit of a problem. Sorry, in the legs, that's going to be a problem because blood flow is not going to be moving that quickly, and it's going to get harder to push that blood back to the heart. Okay. The other problem, especially if we're working with the legs, is that the thing that's kind of combating the blood returning back to the heart from the legs is going to be gravity. Okay. So gravity is going to be naturally pulling that blood down, which is going to make it harder for the blood to get back up to the heart. Everyone kind of following me so far?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that creates a bit of a problem. So what we need is some way to make sure that the blood doesn't flow backwards and stay in our legs, okay? Because if blood stays in our legs, that's gonna be less blood getting to our heart, and then that creates other problems. Okay? So what we have are these valves that are going to be opening and closing in response to our leg muscles. Okay? And so when our leg muscles are relaxed, so here we're looking at a calf muscle. Okay? So when these calf muscles are relaxed, for example, both the valves, both proximally and distally, are going to be closed. And so that is going to prevent blood from flowing back like towards your feet and just staying there. Okay? They're going to be closed, and that's going to kind of hold the blood where it's at. Okay? When you start to contract your calf muscles, for example, okay, that's going to start to increase the pressure within the valves. Okay? And so when that pressure increases, that's going to cause some blood to flow downward, or more distally, and that's going to close up the distal valves. Okay? At the same time, that's going to cause some valves to push upward, okay, more proximally, and that's going to open these proximal valves. Okay? And so as you push the more proximal valves open, blood is now going to be having an easier way to flow back up to the heart. Okay? So that's going to help to keep the blood from pooling in the legs. Okay? And so the reason that's going to be important is because this is going to keep us from passing out. Okay? So has anyone ever seen like someone standing for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden you see them just kind of pass out? They're on the floor all of a sudden.
Yes. Is that why they say to not lock your legs?
Yes.
Yes. This is exactly why they say not to lock your legs. Okay. Yeah. So what happens, and I used to work security over at Levi Stadium where the 49ers play, and every once in a while I would see this happen. So there would always be, or occasionally, there would be a security guard who would just be standing for long periods of time, and I'd be, working security and looking around, and then all of a sudden I see, one of my teammates just fall over. Okay? The reason that happens is because they're not contracting their leg muscles enough. Okay? And if their leg muscles are not contracting, okay, that's going to be more blood staying in their legs. And if there's more blood staying in their legs, that's less blood getting to their heart. And if there's less blood getting to the heart, there's less blood getting to the brain. And the brain is very, very sensitive to blood flow. If the brain doesn't get enough blood flow, it's going to be like, oh, I'm going to get this blood somehow, and it's going to cause you to pass out. So when you pass out, you're initially standing straight, and then you end up lying horizontally because now you're unconscious. Okay? And so the benefit to that is by eliminating gravity as the factor. Okay? And so now your blood is not having to work against gravity to get to your brain. Okay, it just needs to run, back to the heart. Okay, and then from the heart, it can then get to the brain. So it's kind of like a defense mechanism to help make sure that the brain gets enough blood flow. And that's all going to be because you didn't contract your legs enough to get blood back to the heart. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what is when your
really, really
foot falls asleep?
Oh, so when your foot falls asleep.
Because that happens so much.
Yeah. So when your foot falls asleep, what happens usually is you're in some kind of position where your arteries or your veins are kind of constricted. Mm-hmm. And so there's either not enough blood getting to your feet. And so your feet start to feel a little tingly. And so that can happen. The other thing that can happen is if your veins are in a way that they're getting constricted too much, then that blood is going to end up getting pulled in your legs or in your feet, I should say. And then they start to feel a little tingly that way too.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Cool. So Michelle's question, so what about poor circulation and as a result, your feet are cold? Yeah, so that's exactly it too, same thing. So when people have poor circulation, it can be due to a number of factors, but usually it's going to be a result of your arteries not being either as open or you're not transmitting as much blood as you should be able to. And so as a result of that, you end up getting cold organs or cold feet because there's not enough blood to keep your feet warm. Yeah. Okay. So then Nagin said, so you put pressure on your arteries and nerves. One reason why your foot falls asleep. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right, cool. Whoa. Okay. All right. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay. Do we want to take a 10-minute break or do we want to just kind of keep running through this?
I'm good with going through it.
I'm okay with
it.
Me too.
Okay, so we'll keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so varicose veins. So varicose veins can develop typically as we get older, but they can also develop for a number of other conditions as well. And so typically what happens with people's veins is as you get older, we've probably seen this in some of our parents, but as you get older, some of these veins, their valves don't close as well as they should. Okay, so instead of closing up like normal, sometimes they stay a little bit open, and so they end up having blood starting to leak out of the deep veins and then into your superficial veins. And so the blood ends up pooling around the veins that are more superficial and closer to your skin. And so because there's increased blood there, it causes increased pressure inside those veins and causes those guys to distend and it kind of swell up and start to protrude through the skin. And so this can create a little bit of discomfort because it starts to create a little bit of inflammation as some of the fluid begins to leak out of the vessels and into the interstitial spaces. So that can cause some inflammation and then some tenderness of those areas as well. Okay. So that's typically how varicose veins will develop. Okay. Usually in the legs, although they can be found inside the arms as well. Okay. So one of the ways that people can, so Michelle's question is it dangerous? Depending on the situation, it can be dangerous. If it's just because you're getting older, then typically, no, it's not really that dangerous. But if this is happening for more cardiovascular regions, either something happening in your blood vessels where you have an obstruction somewhere, or maybe your heart isn't working as effectively as it should, or your lungs aren't working as effectively as it should, varicose veins can develop as well. And so that will be a situation where it's dangerous. But typically, if it's just because you're getting older and you're fine cardiovascularly, everywhere else, they're typically fine. But Elizabeth's, they do have the ability to burst in some cases too, depending on the severity of it, which can create lots of pain as well. Yeah. Cool. All right. So that is the varicose veins. Okay. So one way that you can kind of go about this is there are some compression socks that people can get at like Walgreens and things like that will put, you can just put them on. And so what those compression socks will do is they'll kind of compress the vessels and then push blood back into the more superficial, or or the deeper veins, and then kind of get that vasculature going. Yeah. So that's one way that you can kind of treat it there. Okay. Okay. So question here. So which of these is a feature of veins of the lower limbs, but not of arteries? So we have the tunica externa, tunica interna, tunica media, valves, or none of the above.
D, valves.
Valve.
Agree.
Yeah, so valves. Right. So valves are going to be found in the veins of lower limbs, but those are the only vessels that will contain valves. So arteries will not have valves, capillaries will not have valves, venules and arterioles will not have valves. They'll only be found inside the veins, but specifically of the lower limbs. Okay. And again, the goal there is to propel blood back up towards the heart. Okay. So now we're going to take a look at some circulation. And so we looked at this in a little bit of detail on Monday, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail today. So when we're looking at circulatory routes and how the blood is able to circulate throughout the body, circulation is going to be what we refer to as parallel, meaning that when the heart contracts, there's going to be a specific portion or a specific percentage of the blood that's going to be directed to specific organs. Okay? So for example, one organ might always get 8% of your blood flow. The brain, for example, always gets 20% of your blood flow. The GI tract is going to get some percentage. Your muscles will get some percentage. So everything in your body gets a certain percentage of your blood flow, of that cardiac output. Okay? And so for that reason, every single organ is going to have access to oxygenated blood, okay? Freshly oxygenated blood. Okay? And there's going to be two basic circulatory routes that we're going to be looking at. The first one is the systemic circulation. Okay, that's going to be the main one we're going to be focusing on today. And then we're going to spend like just a little bit of time talking about the pulmonary circulation because it's pretty straightforward. Okay. So we're going to start with systemic circulation. And so in systemic circulation, we're going to have oxygen and nutrients being carried through typically your systemic arteries to your body tissues. Okay. And then from there, your blood is going to be picking up carbon dioxide and other wastes from those tissues as well. Okay. So all of those systemic arteries are going to be branching off of the aorta in some capacity, okay? And we'll look at that in more detail. Okay. And then all the deoxygenated blood is going to end up returning back to the heart using systemic veins. Okay. And so when the blood returns back to the heart, it's going to come back in one of three pathways. Okay. It's either going to come back to the right ventricle or the right atrium through the superior vena cava, through the inferior vena cava, or through the coronary sinus. Okay. So those are the three major veins that are going to direct the blood directly back into the right atrium. Okay. And so we'll take a look at that in some detail here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at the aorta. Okay. So when we look at the aorta, okay, the aorta is going to be that very large vessel that's going to be coming off of the heart. Okay, so in this picture, we've removed the heart out of the equation here, got rid of the lungs. Okay, so we're just looking at just the aorta here. Okay. So there's four specific regions of the aorta. The first one is called the ascending aorta. And so this is the part that comes off of the heart. Okay? This is the part that's going to be leaving and emerging from the left ventricle. Okay? And so coming off of the ascending aorta, we're going to have those two coronary arteries, the left and right coronary arteries. Okay? The next region is the arch of the aorta, or also called the aortic arch. Okay? And so the aortic arch is going to be this portion here. And that's going to come from the ascending aorta. It's going to loop upward, and then it's going to descend more inferiorly at around the level of the T4 and T5 vertebrae. Okay. So just this little loop here at the top of the aorta is going to be the aortic arch. Okay. Then we have the thoracic aorta. And so the thoracic aorta is going to be this large portion here that's going to descend through the thorax. And so that's going to lie along near the vertebral bodies in the thorax region. And the last one is the abdominal aorta. Okay, so the abdominal aorta is going to be here in the abdomen. And so in order to get to the abdominal aorta, we have the thoracic aorta, and it's going to pass through a hole in the diaphragm called the aortic hiatus. Okay? And then from there, as it passes through that hole, it now will become the abdominal aorta. So typically when we think about the aorta, we're just typically thinking about, just the one part that comes off of the heart. But the aorta is actually a very long blood vessel, a very long artery that's going to pass from the heart through the thorax and then into the abdomen here. Okay. And so coming off the aorta, we're going to have all these different branches of arteries, which we call, which will be the muscular arteries. These are all going to lead to various organs throughout the body. Okay, so this is just a larger picture to kind of help see everything a little bit better. Okay, so then here we have a picture of what this would look like in a cadaver. Here we have the ascending aorta. Here we have the arch of the aorta. And then as we come down, we hit the thoracic aorta, move through the diaphragm, and then down here we have the abdominal aorta. Okay, so we're gonna start by looking at the ascending aorta. Okay, so the ascending aorta is gonna start at the aortic valve inside the heart. Okay? And so it's gonna be directed more superiorly, a little bit anteriorly towards the front of your body, and then to the right of your body. And then it's going to end here at the aortic arch. Okay? So coming off of the ascending aorta, we're going to have the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. Okay? And these are going to pass more superiorly from the aortic valve. Okay? So the right coronary artery, if we remember from Monday, is going to give rise to the posterior interventricular branch, which sits on the posterior aspect of the heart and supplies both ventricles. Okay. We're going to have the marginal branch, which is going to supply the right ventricle specifically here. Okay. Then we also have the left coronary artery coming off of the ascending aorta, and that's going to give rise to the anterior interventricular branch, which again will supply both ventricles, and then the circumflex branch, which will supply the left atrium and the left ventricle. Okay. Okay. So as we go through all these blood vessels, be comfortable with what specific areas these arteries are going to be supplying. Okay. So those are our coronary arteries there. And so we talked about this a little bit on Monday, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of move past this now. And so this is what it would look like in a cadaver. Okay, so here we have the right coronary artery, and it's going to give rise to the marginal branch, which we see over here, and the posterior interventricular branch, which would be on the posterior side of the heart. Here we have the circumflex branch, and then the anterior interventricular branch, which come from the left coronary artery. Okay, that's the arch of, or the ascending aorta. Okay. The next region is the aortic arch. Okay. And so the aortic arch is going to start moving superiorly, it's going to move posteriorly, and then to the left, and then it's going to start moving inferiorly. Okay. And so coming off of the aortic arch, there's going to be three major branches. Okay. These are the three branches of the aorta. These ones you for sure need to know. Okay. The first one is the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay. So the brachiocephalic trunk is going to be the first one. So if you're looking at your patient in anatomical position, that is going to be the one that's on your left and your patient's right. Okay. So coming off of the brachiocephalic trunk, there is the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Okay. But the brachiocephalic trunk is going to be the first branch of the aorta. Okay. And so these will ultimately end up supplying the head, the neck, the upper limb, as well as the thoracic wall. The second branch, the middle one here, is called the left common carotid artery. And so this is going to supply the head and the neck. And the last one is the left subclavian artery. Okay. And so left subclavian artery is going to end up supplying the left vertebral artery, as well as any vessels in the left upper limb, the brain and spinal cord, shoulder, and then the thoracic muscles as well. Okay. So those are the three branches of your aorta. So we have the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. Okay. One thing to make sure that you keep straight is that the right common carotid and the right subclavian are not aortic branches. Okay, they come specifically off the brachiocephalic, but we do have a left common carotid that is part of the aortic arch, and then the left subclavian, which is also part of the aortic arch. Okay, so the way you can kind of remember, kind of the. Let me see if I can kind of get this to go here. The aortic branches is by knowing your A, B, C's. Okay. So the A stands for aortic arch. Okay. The B is your brachiocephalic trunk. The C is your common carotid. but specifically your left common carotid. And then the S is your subclavian artery. And again, that's your left subclavian. Okay. So your ABCs will help you kind of remember your branches of the aorta. Okay. And again, that's going from your left to your right, or your patient's right to their left. Okay. Okay. Everyone okay so far?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So make sure you keep this one in mind for the exam and for the next practical. Okay. So that is that. Okay. So this is just a diagram to help show you where all of these guys are going to be coming from. Let me kind of clear all this. So here we see our brachiocephalic trunk. That's going to give rise to the right common carotid and then the right subclavian. And you can see all the different branches that are going to be coming off from there. Okay. Here we have the left common carotid artery, which is going to give all the different branches from there as well. And then the left subclavian, also giving rise to mostly your arms and then a few other things from there too. Okay. It's just another picture, again, showing the branches that come off of the brachiocephalic trunk. This is a lateral view of the brachiocephalic trunk here. And then this is what it would look like in the cadaver. Okay, so again, you would see your brachiocephalic trunk on your left. The middle one would be the left common carotid artery, and then the left subclavian artery would be the one on your right, okay, your patient's left. Okay, and then just a few other pictures there. Okay, so those ones, like I said, for sure know those ones because those are going to be important. Okay. The next region that we're going to have is our thoracic aorta. Okay, so the thoracic aorta is typically only about 8 inches long, and it's going to lie to the left of the vertebral column. But as you start to descend more inferiorly, it starts to come closer and closer to the midline. Okay. These are arteries I don't want you to worry about too much, but just know that they're there. There's some visceral branches which will supply specific organs. So for example, the bronchial arteries are going to supply the tissues of the lung. Okay. These are going to be different from the pulmonary arteries. These ones are there just to supply nutrients to the lung tissue itself. There's the esophageal arteries, which will supply the esophagus, and then the mediastinal arteries, which will supply the organs inside your mediastinum. Okay. Again, don't worry about those ones, just know that they're there. Okay. And then the parietal branches, there's specific ones, the posterior intercostal arteries and the subcostal arteries, which will supply the skin, the muscles, the ribs, the thoracic vertebrae, the spinal column, or spinal cord, and then the mammary glands. And then the superior phrenic arteries, which will supply the diaphragm itself. Okay. That's the thoracic aorta. And then the next one is the abdominal aorta. Again, don't worry about all of these arteries because there's just too many. I'm not going to touch on all of them. And so the abdominal aorta would be the portion here in the abdomen. And so as it continues to run inferiorly, eventually it reaches the stopping point, and it's going to end up splitting into the right and left common iliac arteries. Okay. And so just like the thoracic aorta, these guys are going to give rise to various blood vessels. So we're going to have the celiac trunk and the superior and mesentery and inferior mesentery arteries. So they're going to supply the GI tract. We have the suprarenal artery, which is going to supply the adrenal glands, the renal artery, which is going to supply the kidneys, gonadal arteries that are going to supply the gonads. And then there's also an inferior phrenic artery, which supplies the diaphragm, and a bunch of other arteries. Okay. These are just a few. There's a ton of them. Again, don't worry about these ones. Just know that they're there. Okay. Okay. And so this is a picture that kind of shows a bunch of these different branches coming off of the abdominal aorta. Okay. Here's what we would see in a cadaver. Here's your renal, your kidneys, for example. So the arteries that lead into the kidneys would be the renal arteries. Again, this would be the abdominal aorta here. Sorry, the abdominal aorta on the right side here. Okay, your right are the patient's left, and then the common iliac arteries here. Okay, so a question here. So in the figure shown, what is the indicated vessel? The first branch of the aortic arch. Is this the brachiocephalic trunk, right common carotid, left common carotid, right subclavian, or left subclavian? What do we think?
It's the T.
D, not
It
D.
should.
Is it?
A?
This first one here.
No, it's brachial. No.
Yes.
Yes, I think I heard it.
Yeah, brachiocephalic.
Yes, brachiocephalic.
Right, the brachiocephalic trunk. Yeah, so this would be the brachiocephalic trunk, this first one coming off of the aorta. Okay. So the first branch coming off the aorta is the brachiocephalic trunk. The second branch would be the left common carotid, and then the right one, or the last one would be the left subclavian. Perfect. Okay. All right, any questions so far?
No.
No. Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to get into the legs. And so we're going to start with our common iliac artery. So as the abdominal aorta reaches its ending point here, it's going to split into a little fork. Okay, that fork is going to be the right common iliac artery and then the left common iliac artery. Okay. Those common iliac arteries are then going to divide further into the internal iliac artery and then the external iliac artery. The internal iliac artery is going to go more on the interior portions of your of your thighs and your pelvic regions, whereas the external iliac artery is going to be more superficial, okay, more on the external surface. And so all three of those, the common iliac arteries, the internal iliac artery, and the external iliac artery, they're all going to help supply the pelvic wall, the pelvic organs like the bladder and the uterus and things like that, and then the external genitals as well as the lower limbs as well. Okay. So these are all going to be supplying basically everything in kind of your pelvic region, okay, as well as your lower limbs. Okay. From there, the external iliac artery is going to eventually become the femoral artery, which is that very long artery along your thigh. Okay. And then it's going to eventually become the popliteal artery. Okay. So the popliteal artery is going to run on the, it's going to basically turn from the anterior side along the posterior side, and it's going to run behind the knee. And I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide. Okay. So the femoral artery is going to supply all the muscles of the thigh. So that's going to be your quadriceps muscles, the hamstrings, the femur, and then as, to a lesser degree, the tendons and ligaments of the knee as well. Okay, so that's the femoral artery there. So then here's a picture over here. So here, again, we have our right iliac, or sorry, our right common carotid iliac, sorry, not carotid artery, right common iliac artery. Okay, then internal iliac artery, and then the right external iliac artery. As it continues to run distally, it's going to become the femoral artery, and then a branch of it is going to branch off, and it's going to run behind the knee, and then form your right popliteal artery. Okay, so those are all of the arteries I want you to be comfortable with for the exam. Okay, so just worry about those ones. Okay. The next ones we're going to see here are the veins, and so veins can be either superficial or deep. Okay, arteries will typically only be deep, but veins can either be superficial or deep. The superficial ones are going to be the ones that are located just beneath the skin, and these are the ones that are going to be most important in a clinical setting. And so that's going to be where if doctors need to inject any drugs or anything like that, or any IVs, they're going to be going through any of the superficial veins. Okay. The deep veins will usually run alongside the arteries. Okay. So again, we're going to have three systemic veins, okay, three major systemic veins that are going to be returning blood back to the heart. Okay. Those would be the coronary sinus, which is going to return blood from the myocardium. Okay. All the blood that gets delivered to the myocardium to supply it, that's going to be drained through the coronary sinus. Okay. Then we have the superior vena cava. And so the superior vena cava is going to drain blood from everywhere above the level of the heart. Okay. So that would be the head, the neck, the upper limbs, and the thorax. Okay. So any blood coming from anywhere above the heart is going to be returning back to the heart through the superior vena cava. Okay. And then the last one is the inferior vena cava. And so that is going to be draining blood from everywhere below the level of the heart. Okay. So that's going to be the abdomen, the pelvis, and the lower limbs. Okay. Regardless of which of these three veins that blood is going to be returning to the heart through, it's always going to be dropped off here into the right atrium. Okay. So there's a bunch of veins we're going to be going over, or there's a bunch of veins in the body. We're only going to go over a few of them. And so the first one that I want us to be comfortable with is the internal jugular vein. Okay. So the internal jugular vein is going to drain blood from the interior portions of your head. Okay. Specifically the brain, the meninges surrounding the brain, and then the bones of the cranium, and then the muscles of the face and the neck. Okay. So all of the internal portions of the head are going to be drained by the internal jugular vein, and they're going to be returned back to the heart. Okay. The second one is the external jugular vein. Okay, and so the external jugular vein is going to drain blood from the external portions of the heart. Okay, so the skin of the head, the neck, and the oral cavity, around the pharynx, which is your throat, and then some of the muscles of the face and neck as well. Okay, so again, those outer portions, those external portions of the head and the neck, are going to be drained by the external jugular vein. So that's a kind of easy way to kind of remember those two. And then we also have a vertebral vein. And so the vertebral veins will drain blood from the cervical vertebrae. Okay, so those are those first few veins there. Okay. So this is what it would look like in a cadaver. Here we see our superior vena cava leading into the right atrium here. Okay. So here we would have our right internal jugular vein, which would again go to the interior portions of the head. We have the external jugular vein, which would go to the exterior portions of the head. And we can't see the vertebral arteries, but they would all be draining into the superior vena cava here. Because again, they're coming from areas above the heart. Okay. When we get into the, oh yeah, go ahead. Is there a question? Okay. Okay, so when we get into the upper limbs, there's going to be 4 major veins here. And so the first vein, so these are the deep veins. These are going to have the same name as their corresponding arteries. So here we have the right subclavian vein. And so the subclavian vein is going to drain blood from the skin, the muscles, and bones from the arms and the shoulders. Okay? And then to a lesser extent, the neck and the superior thorax as well. So that's going to be this portion right here. Okay. As we move a little bit more distally, we're going to reach the brachial veins. Okay. And so the brachial veins are going to drain blood from the muscles and bones of the elbow and the upper arm, okay, around your humerus region. Okay. Then we have the ulnar veins, which again are more distal, and so these are going to be running along your ulna bone, so along the medial aspect of your forearm. Okay. And so these are going to drain all the muscles and bones and the skin of the hand and your medial forearm. Okay. So everywhere medially, that is going to be drained by the ulnar veins. And then the radial veins are going to be draining all the muscles and bones of the lateral forearm and the lateral aspects of your hand as well. Okay. So all of these guys will eventually feed into the right subclavian vein and then into the superior vena cava from there. Okay. Then we have some more superficial veins. So these ones are a little bit larger than the deep veins. And so the first one is the cephalic vein. The cephalic vein is on the lateral side of your arm. And so that is going to drain the integument and the superficial muscles of the arm. And then here we have the basilic veins, which drain the medial portions of the arm. And then the median antecubital veins here, which are going to drain your forearm and then your palm as well. Okay. Okay, so those are the veins. There's only one vein of the lower limb that I do want us to know, and so that is the great saphenous vein. Okay. So the great saphenous vein is the longest vein in the body. So it runs from your ankle all the way up until you reach your thigh. Okay. So just one single vein that will eventually feed into your external iliac vein and then into your inferior vena cava from here. And so the role of the great saphenous vein is to drain all of the skin and the muscles of the lower limbs, the groin, and then the lower abdominal wall. Okay. And again, it'll feed all of that eventually into the inferior vena cava from here. And so that's the only vein I want us to be comfortable with for the lower limbs. Okay, so that is the extent of the systemic circulation that I want you to be familiar with. Okay. Any questions on the systemic circulation?
Not right now.
No, I guess we're good.
Okay, so just to kind of clarify, all I want you to know is the specific veins that were circled, specific arteries and veins that were circled, and what regions they supply. Okay. Anything that wasn't circled, don't worry about it. Okay, so then the last one is our pulmonary circulation. And so the pulmonary circulation is going to be relatively simple, relatively straightforward. And so we went over this a little bit on Monday here. And we're going to kind of go through it real quick. Again, there's not a whole lot to it, but the pulmonary circulation is going to start in the right ventricle. Okay? So when the right ventricle contracts, it's going to be pumping out deoxygenated blood out of the right ventricle and into the pulmonary trunk. Okay? Once that blood reaches the pulmonary trunk will then split into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Okay? So each pulmonary artery is going to go to its corresponding lung. Okay, so the left pulmonary artery is going to go to the left lung. The right pulmonary artery is going to go to the right lung. Okay? And so it's going to distribute that, that deoxygenated blood to that specific lung. Okay? So once the blood reaches the lung, okay, the pulmonary artery is eventually going to divide into the pulmonary capillaries, and that is going to be where we're going to exchange our oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so in the pulmonary capillaries, we're going to be getting rid of our carbon dioxide, and then we're going to be picking up oxygen that we just breathed in, and then now we have oxygenated blood. Okay. So then from there, that oxygenated blood is then going to leave the lungs, and then it's going to pass out of the lungs through the pulmonary veins. Okay. There's a total of 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the left lung and 2 from the right lung. But all 4 pulmonary veins are going to drop off that blood into the left atrium. Okay. And then that's how we end up with oxygenated blood in the heart. Okay. And then eventually we pump that out through the systemic circulation. Okay. And that's all there is for pulmonary circulation. Okay. A lot easier than the systemic. Okay, so this is just a little schematic here that kind of helps, again, kind of show this all in context. Here we have a right atrium, right ventricle, okay, again, moving out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary trunk, which is going to be sitting in front of the aorta. It's going to divide into the left pulmonary artery, right pulmonary artery, get delivered to the lungs, and then return from, leave the lungs through the pulmonary veins, and then re-enter the right atrium of the heart. Sorry, the left atrium of the heart. And that is all there is for that. Here's a picture of a cadaver. So here is the the pulmonary trunk when it's been cut open. Here we see the left pulmonary artery leading into the left lung. Here we see the right pulmonary artery leading into the right lung, okay? And then so on and so forth. Okay, and that is it for blood vessels. Okay. Any questions on anything we have covered today?
No. Not right now.
Okay. All right. So, yeah.
Did you say veins only carry oxygenated blood and arteries?
No. No, not necessarily. Okay. So, veins will only carry blood to the heart. Arteries will only carry blood away from the heart. Okay. So this is kind of where that difference, or that kind of difference in thinking kind of comes into play. So you can't think that arteries will always carry oxygenated blood, because here we see that pulmonary arteries will be carrying deoxygenated blood, whereas in the systemic circulation, it's going to be carrying oxygenated blood. Okay, so arteries are going to be carrying oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood depending on where you're looking. So you can't use oxygenation as a tool to determine whether you're looking at an artery or a vein. Okay? And then same thing with deoxygenated blood. Okay, so if we look at the veins, okay, veins will typically be carrying deoxygenated blood in the systems, in your normal body systems, okay, like in your legs and things like that. But if you look back at the lungs, Okay, here we have pulmonary veins carrying oxygenated blood. Okay, so again, you cannot use oxygenation as a way to determine whether you're looking at an artery or a vein. Okay, you have to be looking at the direction and where that blood is going. Is it going away from the heart? If so, it's an artery. If it's going towards the heart, then it's a vein. Okay, that's all there is to it. Okay. Yeah. Good question. So that's a point of clarification that we want to make sure that we got straight. Okay. Any other questions here?